November 3, 1944. Across war-torn Europe, German forces retreated from positions they had held for years, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and in some cases personnel who could no longer keep pace with the desperate withdrawal. In prisoner of war camps from California to Massachusetts, captured German soldiers adjusted to captivity with varying degrees of resignation and defiance. But in a small facility outside Fort Mitchell, Kansas, something was about to happen that would challenge everything both captors and captives believed about abundance, deprivation, and the power of a simple slice of cake. Before we discover what transformed these women from enemies into something no one expected, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins on a cold morning in early November, when 43 German women arrived at the hastily converted warehouse that would serve as their prison. These weren't frontline soldiers, but members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the chaotic Allied advance through France. They had served as communication specialists, medical personnel, and administrative staff for the Wehrmacht. Now they stood in a gravel courtyard, their gray uniforms torn and stained, their faces reflecting exhaustion that went deeper than physical weariness. Captain Evelyn Chandler watched from her office window as the women descended from transport trucks. She had requested this assignment specifically, believing that female prisoners required a different approach than the male POW camps she had visited. What she saw troubled her immediately. These women weren't just tired. They were hollow-eyed and gaunt in a way that spoke of months, perhaps years, of inadequate nutrition. Among the new arrivals stood 24-year-old Hertha Adler, clutching a small canvas bag that contained everything she still owned in the world. A communications officer from Dresden, she had joined the Auxiliary Corps in 1942, believing the propaganda about defending the fatherland. Now, standing in an American prison camp, she felt only numbness. The journey from the capture point in France had been long, and the rations provided barely enough to keep them alive. She had forgotten what it felt like to have a full stomach. Beside her, 19-year-old Hannah-Laura Werner swayed slightly on her feet. The youngest of the group, Laura had been captured just 3 months after her deployment as a radio operator. Her ribs showed prominently through her thin uniform, and her hands trembled constantly from a combination of cold and malnutrition. She kept her eyes downcast, afraid that meeting the Americans' gaze would reveal just how terrified she truly was. The women were processed with mechanical efficiency. They surrendered what few possessions they carried, received prisoner identification numbers, and were assigned to barracks. Throughout the procedure, they maintained the military bearing that had been drilled into them, standing straight despite their weakness. But Hertha noticed something unexpected. The American guards weren't cruel. They weren't even particularly harsh. They simply went about their duties with a professional detachment that somehow felt more unsettling than outright hostility would have been. At least hostility she would have understood. The first meal in captivity arrived at 6 o'clock that evening. The women filed into a dining hall that had been set up in the converted warehouse, their movements slow and cautious. Long tables with benches reminded Hertha of her school days in Dresden, though those memories felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. The room smelled of disinfectant and something else she couldn't quite identify, something that made her stomach clench with an emotion she didn't recognize. American guards directed them to their seats with gestures and simple commands. Most of the women spoke little English, relying on Hertha and a few others who had studied the language before the war to translate basic instructions. They sat in rigid silence, their hands folded in their laps, waiting to see what provisions their captors would provide. When the food arrived, carried by American soldiers in kitchen whites, Hertha felt her breath catch. The portions were larger than anything she had seen in months. Bread that looked almost white, not the dark, dense ersatz bread they had subsisted on in Germany. Some kind of stew with visible pieces of meat. carrots and potatoes that hadn't been stretched with sawdust or other fillers, and butter, actual butter, in small portions beside each bread roll. Laura Werner stared at her plate as if it might disappear if she looked away. Her hands remained in her lap, trembling more violently now. Beside her, Wilhelmina Schultz, a 22-year-old nurse everyone called Minna, reached out tentatively to touch the bread roll. It felt soft under her fingers, still slightly warm. In the field hospitals where she had worked, bread had been rationed to thin slices of something that barely qualified as food. No one moved to eat. The women exchanged glances, uncertain whether this was some kind of test or trick. In their experience, nothing came without conditions, without demands. Surely the Americans would expect something in return for food like this. The silence in the hall grew heavy with tension and confusion. Captain Chandler stood near the entrance, observing. She had anticipated this reaction. The reports from other POW camps had described similar responses from newly arrived prisoners, particularly those who had been serving in Europe during the final desperate months of German resistance. Malnutrition had become so common among German forces that adequate food seemed suspicious. She stepped forward and addressed the room, with Lieutenant Gladys Templeton translating into German. "This is your evening meal. It will be provided twice daily, at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. There are no conditions attached to receiving food. You are prisoners, but you are also under the protection of the Geneva Convention, which requires that we provide adequate nutrition." Hertha translated quietly for those near her who hadn't understood. The words made little sense. Adequate nutrition without conditions? It contradicted everything they had experienced over the past 2 years of service. In Germany, even civilians received rations based on their usefulness to the war effort. The bread felt like a lie in Hertha's hands. She broke off a small piece, examining it closely for signs of contamination or adulteration. The texture was impossibly light, the color almost pure white. In Germany, such bread existed only in memories from before the war. She brought it slowly to her lips, still half convinced this was some elaborate American psychological warfare tactic. The taste, when it finally touched her tongue, nearly broke her composure. Real wheat flour, no sawdust, no ground chestnuts, no potato peel filler, just bread as bread was meant to be. She chewed slowly, afraid to swallow, afraid this moment of plenty would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. Around her, other women were having similar revelations, their faces reflecting disbelief and something close to pain. Minna Schultz had tears running down her cheeks as she ate. As a nurse, she had watched soldiers and civilians alike slowly starve on inadequate rations. She had learned to ignore her own hunger, to function on whatever scraps remained after patients were fed. Now, confronted with actual food in quantities she hadn't seen in years, something inside her cracked open. She ate mechanically, unable to stop, her body overriding her mind's warnings about eating too much too quickly after prolonged deprivation. Laura Werner managed 3 bites before her stomach rebelled. Months of near starvation had shrunk her capacity, and her body didn't remember how to process real food anymore. She pushed the plate away, tears of frustration joining Minna's tears of overwhelm. She was so hungry, desperately hungry, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The irony was almost unbearable. The American soldiers serving the meal noticed these reactions. Private Joaquin Delgado, who worked in the kitchen under Sergeant Bowman, watched with growing discomfort. He had grown up poor in New Mexico, had known hunger himself during the Depression years. But he had never seen people react to basic food as if it were a miracle. These women weren't acting. Their shock was genuine, their tears real. He approached Captain Chandler after the meal service ended. "Ma'am, I don't think we should serve such large portions at first. Some of them got sick. My abuela, she always said, you have to ease a starving person back to eating slowly." Chandler nodded, having observed the same problems. "You're right, Private. Work with Sergeant Bowman to adjust portion sizes for the first week. Smaller amounts more frequently, if possible. We need to let their bodies remember how to process adequate nutrition. That night in the barracks, the women lay in their bunks, most unable to sleep despite their exhaustion. Their stomachs, unaccustomed to real food, cramped and churned. But more than physical discomfort kept them awake. The bread had raised a question none of them wanted to voice aloud. If the Americans could provide such food to their prisoners, what did that say about the scarcity they had been told was affecting everyone equally? 3 weeks into their captivity, the routines of prison life had become familiar. Morning roll call at 6, breakfast of oatmeal or eggs with bread, work assignments in the laundry or administrative offices, lunch of soup and sandwiches, afternoon recreation period in the courtyard, dinner at 6, lights out at 9. The women moved through these rhythms with growing strength as their bodies slowly adjusted to regular meals. The hollows in their cheeks began to fill. The trembling in their hands gradually subsided, but they remained emotionally distant, speaking little to their captors beyond necessary communication. They formed tight clusters during recreation periods, conversing only in German, maintaining the psychological barrier between themselves and their American guards. They were still enemies, still at war, even if their immediate circumstances had improved beyond anything they had expected. Everything changed on November 23rd, the American holiday called Thanksgiving. The women had been told through Lieutenant Templeton's translations that this was a day of gratitude and feasting in American tradition. They expected perhaps slightly larger portions at dinner, maybe an extra roll. What they received instead shattered every remaining assumption they held about American character and abundance. The dining hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves created by local school children. The tables were covered with cheap cotton cloths in orange and brown. When the food arrived, carried by the entire kitchen staff working in coordinated effort, the German women simply stared in collective incomprehension. Roasted turkey, golden and glistening, mashed potatoes in quantities that seemed obscene, gravy, stuffing, green beans, cranberry sauce, rolls with real butter. And then, after they had eaten more than seemed possible, the desserts arrived. Sergeant Clarence Bowman, called Clay by everyone, personally carried out the first pie. A Georgia man in his late 30s, Clay had been a baker before the war, working in his family's shop in Savannah. He had volunteered for kitchen duty specifically because he believed feeding people was the most honest work a person could do. He set the pumpkin pie on the nearest table with visible pride in his creation. But it was the coconut cake that stopped every conversation in the room. Private Delgado carried it out on a special platter, the 3-layer confection towering impossibly high. White frosting covered every surface, and shredded coconut had been pressed into the frosting until the entire cake looked like fresh snow. The women had never seen anything like it. In Germany, such extravagance would have been impossible even before the war. Sugar had been rationed for years. Real coconut was a tropical luxury that existed only in photographs. Hertha found herself standing without conscious decision, drawn toward the cake as if magnetized. Other women rose with her, forming a semicircle around the dessert table. They didn't reach for it, didn't ask for portions. They simply stood and looked, trying to reconcile the existence of such abundance with everything they had been told. Sergeant Bowman watched the German women staring at his coconut cake with an expression he couldn't quite read. Pride mixed with something else, something that made him uncomfortable. He had baked this cake the same way his mama had taught him back in Savannah, using real butter and fresh eggs, coconut imported from the Philippines, and sugar without a second thought about rationing. For him, this was just Thanksgiving dessert. For them, it appeared to be something else entirely. He picked up a knife and began cutting generous slices, placing each piece carefully on small plates. Private Delgado helped distribute them, moving down the tables where the women had returned to their seats in silence. When Hertha received her slice, she looked down at it with an expression that reminded Clay uncomfortably of the way his daughter had looked at her first Christmas present after his wife died. A mixture of wonder and grief that something so simple could mean so much. The first bite was a revelation that went beyond taste. Sugar, real sugar. Not the saccharine substitutes they had grown accustomed to in Germany, butter that melted on the tongue, the exotic sweetness of coconut, something Hertha had only read about in books. The cake was moist and light, each layer separated by frosting that tasted like vanilla clouds. She chewed slowly, and then something inside her broke completely. Tears ran down her face before she could stop them. Not delicate tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Minna Schultz covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving. Laura Werner cried silently, tears dripping onto her plate, mixing with the white frosting. Inga Kruger, normally so composed, made small gasping sounds as she ate and wept simultaneously. The American personnel watched with growing alarm. This wasn't the reaction Clay had expected. He had thought the women would be pleased, maybe grateful. He hadn't anticipated this collective breakdown. Captain Chandler moved quickly through the room, trying to assess whether medical intervention was needed, whether someone was choking or experiencing some kind of crisis, but Lieutenant Templeton understood. She had studied German before the war, had spent a semester in Berlin back in 1938. She knew what rationing had meant in Germany, how it had intensified year after year, until even the most basic foods became precious luxuries. "They're not in distress, Captain," she said quietly. "They've just forgotten what abundance tastes like. For some of them, this might be the first real sugar they've had in years." Hertha heard this explanation through her tears and found her voice, speaking in halting English. "In Germany, we are told everyone suffers equally in war. We are told Americans also starve, also ration everything. We are told you are poor, desperate, barely surviving." She gestured at the half-eaten cake on her plate. "This is not starvation. This is not suffering. You feed your prisoners what we could not feed ourselves when we were free." The day after Thanksgiving, something shifted in the compound. The women moved differently, held themselves with less rigidity. The coconut cake had done what months of adequate rations could not. It had forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth about the propaganda they had believed. If the Americans could spare such luxury for their prisoners, then perhaps everything else they had been told was equally false. Hertha found herself volunteering for kitchen duty when Lieutenant Templeton posted the new work assignments. She wasn't alone. Minna Lotta Bergman and Edelgard Schreiber also requested kitchen work. They offered no explanation for their choice, but Captain Chandler approved the assignments without question. She suspected the women needed to understand the source of the abundance that had shaken them so profoundly. Sergeant Bowman greeted his new workers with cautious optimism. He had been warned that German prisoners might attempt sabotage, might refuse to work, might create problems. Instead, he found himself facing 4 women who looked at his kitchen supplies with something approaching reverence. Hertha touched the 50-pound sack of flour as if it were sacred, her fingers tracing the printed label that proclaimed its contents in bold letters. "In Germany," she said slowly in English, "flour is stretched with potato starch, ground acorns, even sawdust near the end. Pure wheat flour like this we have not seen since before the war began." She looked at Clay directly for the first time. "How can you afford to feed prisoners this way when you also feed your soldiers, your citizens?" Clay considered the question carefully. He had never thought much about American agricultural abundance, had taken for granted the productivity of heartland farms, the efficiency of food distribution networks. "Ma'am, America is blessed with good farmland and lots of it. We produce more food than we can eat ourselves. Always have. My family's bakery back in Savannah, we never lacked for supplies even during the Depression. We might have lacked for customers with money to pay, but we never lacked for flour and sugar." The concept seemed incomprehensible to the German women. Mina asked through Hertha's translation whether this abundance existed everywhere in America or only in military facilities. Clay laughed, not unkindly. "Everywhere, ma'am. In fact, civilians eat better than we do in the military. No rationing for them like you have in Europe. They can buy pretty much whatever they want, whenever they want it, assuming they have the money." That afternoon, Clay taught the women how to make biscuits, simple butter biscuits that required flour, butter, milk, baking powder, and salt. Ingredients he measured out without thinking, quantities that made the German women exchange glances of disbelief. He demonstrated the cutting technique, how to fold the butter into the flour, how to handle the dough gently to keep the biscuits light and flaky. Hertha's hands remembered skills from childhood, from watching her grandmother bake before the war. But the last time she had worked with such quality ingredients, she had been perhaps 10 years old. The muscle memory returned slowly, and with it came memories of a Germany that no longer existed, a time before scarcity had become the defining feature of daily life. Sergeant Clay Bowman had not expected to find common ground with German prisoners. His brother had died at Normandy, killed in the first hours of the invasion. His cousin had lost an arm in the Ardennes. He had every reason to hate these women, to see them as representatives of the enemy that had cost his family so much. But standing in the kitchen, watching Hertha carefully measure flour with shaking hands, he saw something else entirely. He saw his own mama during the Depression, stretching meals to feed 6 children when his daddy could barely find work. He had grown up understanding hunger not as starvation, but as the constant mental arithmetic of making food last until the next paycheck. His mama had performed miracles with cornmeal and dried beans, had made sure her children never went to bed with completely empty stomachs, even when she herself ate nothing but the scraps they left behind. That experience had shaped his approach to cooking, had made him believe that feeding people was a form of love, perhaps the most fundamental form. Now, watching these German women react to basic ingredients as if they were treasures, he felt his mama's spirit in the kitchen with him. She would have fed them too, enemy or not. She would have said that hunger doesn't care about politics, that a starving person is a starving person regardless of the uniform they wear. Clay found himself talking to the women as he worked, his Georgia drawl slow and patient, waiting for Hertha to translate. My mama used to say that you can tell everything about a person's character by how they treat people who can't do anything for them in return. She fed hobos during the Depression, men riding the rails looking for work. My daddy would complain about wasting food on strangers, but Mama said hunger was hunger, and she wouldn't turn away anyone who asked. He paused, kneading dough for the evening's bread. I guess that's why I volunteered for kitchen duty. Figured if I had to be in this war, I'd rather feed people than shoot them. Mina listened to Hertha's translation with intense focus. She asked a question in German, which Hertha conveyed. She wants to know if your mother would have fed German prisoners too, even knowing what Germany has done in this war. Clay considered this seriously. Honestly, yes. Mama believed in the Bible literally. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. She would have said that you ladies didn't start this war, didn't make the decisions that led to all this suffering. She would have seen you as daughters, sisters, mothers, not as enemies. He looked directly at Mina. That's how I'm trying to see you too. The afternoon passed in productive silence, punctuated by Clay's patient instruction. He showed them how Americans measured ingredients by volume rather than weight, demonstrated the difference between baking powder and baking soda, explained why American cakes were lighter and sweeter than German baked goods. The women absorbed everything with hungry attention that had nothing to do with physical appetite. Private Joaquin Delgado had been watching the German women in the kitchen with growing curiosity. Unlike Sergeant Bowman, whose kindness came from deep Baptist faith and Southern hospitality, Joaquin's approach to the prisoners came from his own experience of otherness. His family had faced discrimination in New Mexico, had been treated as foreigners despite living on land that had been Mexican before it was American. He understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion, to have your loyalty questioned because of your name and your accent. He noticed small things about the women that others missed. How Lotta Bergman always washed her hands before touching food, even when they were already clean, as if she couldn't quite believe she was allowed to handle such abundance. How Edelgard Schreiber studied the recipe cards posted on the kitchen wall with the intensity of someone memorizing sacred texts. How Hertha translated not just words but cultural context, trying to help her fellow prisoners understand an America that contradicted everything they had been taught. One morning, Joaquin brought in fresh chili peppers from a local farmer who grew them specially for him. The smell filled the kitchen immediately, bright and sharp and completely unlike anything in traditional army cooking. The German women looked at the peppers with curiosity mixed with apprehension. Hertha asked what they were, and Joaquin's face lit up with enthusiasm. "These are hatched chilies from New Mexico, where I grew up. My abuela, my grandmother, she would roast them every fall. The whole neighborhood would smell like chilies for weeks." He began explaining how to roast them, how to peel away the charred skin, how to incorporate them into stews and sauces. "Food is how my family shows love. We don't always say the words, but we make sure everyone eats well. That's how you know you're cared for." The concept resonated with the German women in unexpected ways. Mina spoke through Hertha. "In Germany, too, we show love through food. My mother would save her own rations to make sure my younger brothers had enough. She would pretend she had already eaten, that she was not hungry. We knew she was lying, but we also knew refusing her sacrifice would hurt her more than the hunger hurt her body." The conversation opened a floodgate. Each woman shared memories of food from before the war, from childhood, from times when meals were about nourishment and family rather than mere survival. Lotta remembered her father's Sunday roasts, how the whole family would gather around the table. Edelgard described her aunt's Christmas stollen, the candied fruit and marzipan that made it special. Inga Kruger, usually so quiet, spoke about her mother's potato pancakes, crispy on the outside and soft inside, served with applesauce. Clay listened to these stories and recognized something profound. These women weren't so different from his own family, from Joaquin's family, from any family that understood food as love made tangible. The war had turned them into enemies, but hunger and the memory of abundance transcended those boundaries. December arrived with bitter cold that reminded the German women of home. Snow fell on the compound, covering everything in white that looked clean and pure, unlike the muddy gray slush they remembered from their final months of service in France. They had been in American captivity for 5 weeks now, long enough for their bodies to recover from malnutrition, long enough for the initial shock of abundance to fade into something more contemplative. Captain Chandler had been observing the changes in her prisoners with professional interest that was gradually becoming personal concern. These women were adjusting too well, becoming too comfortable. She worried about what would happen when repatriation orders eventually came. How would they readjust to the deprivation waiting for them in defeated Germany? She raised these concerns with Lieutenant Templeton during their morning briefing. "Perhaps we should reduce their rations gradually, help them prepare for the scarcity they'll face when they return home," Chandler suggested, though the words felt wrong even as she spoke them. Templeton shook her head firmly. "With respect, Captain, I don't think that's our responsibility. Our responsibility is to treat them humanely while they're under our care. What happens after repatriation is beyond our control." The conversation was interrupted by an unusual request. Hertha had asked to speak with Captain Chandler privately, something she had never done before. When she entered the office, she carried a small notebook that she had been given for English language practice. Her expression was serious but not hostile, determined but not defiant. "Captain Chandler, I come to ask something unusual," she began in careful English. "The women, we have been talking. We wish to learn American recipes, not just to make here, but to remember, to take with us when we are returned to Germany." She paused, searching for words. "We want to remember that abundance is possible, that food can be more than survival. We want to teach others what we have learned about plenty." The request caught Chandler completely off guard. She had expected questions about repatriation timing, about male privileges, about family contact, not recipe requests. You want to learn how to make American food? Yes, but also we want to understand why American food is different. Sergeant Bowman, he uses so much butter, so much sugar, things we learn to measure carefully. Private Delgado, he adds spices we never heard of. This is not just cooking, this is different philosophy about food, about life. Hertha's intensity grew as she spoke. In Germany, we are taught to be efficient, to waste nothing, to measure everything precisely. Here, you are generous. You add extra butter because it tastes better. You make cake for no special reason. This is not just recipe, this is different way of thinking. Chandler found herself moved by the observation. You're saying that our abundance has changed how you think about scarcity? Yes, exactly. We thought scarcity was natural, was normal. We thought everyone struggles like Germany struggles. Now we know this is not true. The recipe exchange project began informally, but quickly became the most important activity in the compound. Sergeant Bowman brought his mama's handwritten recipe book from home, pages yellowed and stained with decades of use. The German women gathered around it as if it were a rare manuscript, their fingers hovering over the cursive script they couldn't read, but could somehow understand through the smudges of flour and splashes of vanilla that marked each page. Hertha appointed herself chief translator and scribe. She created a system where Bowman would demonstrate a recipe while explaining each step, and she would write it down in both English and German. The other women contributed observations, asking questions about ingredient substitutions, about why Americans used certain techniques. What began as simple recipe documentation evolved into something deeper, a dialogue about culture and values expressed through measurements and methods. Why do Americans add so much sugar to everything? Lotta asked one afternoon, as Bowman demonstrated his mama's sweet potato casserole, a dish that seemed to the German women more like dessert than a side dish. Clay considered the question seriously, recognizing it wasn't just about cooking, but about understanding a fundamental difference in worldview. I think it's because we can, he answered honestly. We have enough sugar that we don't. We have to save it only for special occasions. My mama used to say that life is hard enough without making food boring when you don't have to. If you can afford to make something taste a little better, a little sweeter, why wouldn't you? He paused, watching their faces. I know that sounds wasteful to you, but in America, we've been blessed with abundance. Seems wrong not to enjoy it. Edelgard spoke through Hertha's translation. In Germany, we are taught that denial builds character, that suffering makes us stronger. We are told that easy living makes people weak, that hardship is good for the soul. Americans seem to believe the opposite, that comfort and plenty are good things to pursue. The observation struck Clay as profound. He had never thought about American abundance as a philosophical position, but Edelgard was right. Americans did believe that prosperity was a good thing, that making life easier and more pleasant was a worthy goal. I guess we figure that God gave us this land and its plenty for a reason. Not enjoying it would be like refusing a gift, but we're also supposed to share it, help others who don't have as much. That's why even in prison camps, we feed people well. Seems like the right thing to do. Minna had been quietly observing this conversation while preparing vegetables for the evening stew. She spoke suddenly in halting English, not waiting for Hertha to translate her German. In hospital, I see soldiers starve slowly, not because no food exists, but because food goes to more important people first. Party members, officers, important workers, regular soldiers, we get what remains. This is called efficiency, called proper resource allocation. But really, it is just cruelty dressed in logic. Her words hung in the kitchen like smoke. The other German women nodded slowly, recognizing a truth they had all observed but never quite articulated. The Third Reich's hierarchy of value had determined who ate and who starved, who mattered and who didn't. America's relative abundance allowed for a different ethic, one where even prisoners received generous portions. The kitchen became an unofficial classroom where more than recipes were exchanged. As December progressed, and the women's English improved through daily conversation. Discussions ranged far beyond cooking techniques. They asked questions about American life that revealed how thoroughly propaganda had shaped their understanding of the country they had been taught to view as an enemy. Private Delgado found himself explaining that no, Americans didn't live in poverty and desperation. That, yes, regular citizens could buy meat whenever they wanted. That the photographs they had been shown of Depression-era breadlines were from over a decade ago, not current conditions. But we were told that American capitalism creates terrible inequality, that most Americans are exploited by the wealthy few, Inga said one morning as she helped Joaquin prepare masa for tamales, a Christmas tradition he wanted to share. We were told that workers in America barely survive while factory owners grow rich on their labor. Joaquin laughed, though not mockingly. There's some truth in that, honestly. We do have inequality, but even poor Americans, most of them, eat regularly. My family was poor during the Depression. We struggled, no question, but we never starved. We always had beans and rice, tortillas, chilies from the garden. Being poor in America isn't the same as being poor in Europe. The scale is different. These conversations forced the German women to reconstruct their entire understanding of the world. Every assumption they had made about American weakness and desperation had been proven false by the simple evidence of daily prison camp meals. If the propaganda about American scarcity was a lie, what else had been false? The question haunted them during work hours and kept them awake at night in the barracks. Hertha wrote in her notebook, creating a parallel text beside the recipes. For each dish she learned to make, she recorded not just ingredients and instructions, but reflections on what that dish revealed about American culture. Coconut cake represented abundance used for simple pleasure. Biscuits represented the efficiency of making something delicious quickly. Joaquin's tamales represented immigrant traditions, preserved and celebrated rather than suppressed. Each recipe became a lens for understanding a society that functioned according to principles completely different from those she had been taught. Captain Chandler received reports about these kitchen discussions from Lieutenant Templeton, who occasionally observed the cooking sessions. "They're deprogramming themselves," Templeton said during one of their briefings. "Every meal, every recipe, every conversation chips away at the Nazi worldview. Food is doing what months of lectures and propaganda films could never accomplish." Chandler nodded slowly. "Because they can taste the truth. You can argue with words, dismiss them as enemy propaganda, but you can't argue with butter and sugar, with portions large enough to satisfy genuine hunger. The abundance speaks for itself." Christmas approached, and Sergeant Bowman announced he would teach the women how to make fruitcake, a Southern tradition that took weeks of preparation. The women listened with fascination as he described candied fruits soaking in rum, how the cakes would be wrapped in cheesecloth soaked with brandy, how they would age for weeks and become more flavorful with time. The concept of making food that wouldn't be eaten immediately, that was created specifically to improve over time, represented a luxury of planning and patience that German wartime scarcity had made impossible. The fruitcakes sat wrapped in their brandy-soaked cheesecloth in the kitchen's cool storage room, and their presence became symbolic of something larger than holiday tradition. These cakes represented the ability to think beyond immediate need, to invest resources in future pleasure rather than present survival. The German women visited them daily, marveling that food could be treated this way, that abundance allowed for such patience. But abundance also raised uncomfortable questions that the women could no longer avoid. If America could feed its prisoners this generously while simultaneously fighting a war on two fronts, what did that say about Germany's constant claims of necessity, about the rationing that had grown increasingly severe, about the priorities that had determined who ate and who went hungry? Hertha found herself lying awake in the barracks long after lights out, pursuing these thoughts to their logical conclusions. Germany had not been starving because of Allied blockades or resource shortages alone. Germany had been starving because the Nazi regime had prioritized weapons production over food distribution, had directed resources toward war machinery rather than civilian welfare, had decided that some lives were worth feeding and others were expendable. The revelation was devastating because it was so obvious in retrospect. She had seen the disparities herself, had noticed how party members always seemed well-fed while regular citizens grew thinner. She had simply accepted the explanations offered that this was necessary for the war effort, that everyone must sacrifice. Now she understood that sacrifice had never been equally distributed. Some had sacrificed everything, while others had sacrificed nothing at all. Mina was wrestling with similar realizations. As a nurse, she had witnessed the hierarchy of medical care. Officers received treatment that soldiers were denied. German citizens received care that foreign laborers could not access. She had told herself this was practical, that limited resources required difficult choices. But the American prison camp demonstrated that resources had never been as limited as she had been told. The limitation had been one of will, of moral priority, not of actual scarcity. One evening after dinner, Lotta approached Lieutenant Templeton with a request. She wanted access to American newspapers, specifically articles about conditions in occupied Germany. She wanted to read American accounts of what Allied forces were discovering as they advanced through German territory. Templeton hesitated, knowing such information might be disturbing, might cause psychological distress, but she also recognized the courage it took to ask. The newspapers arrived the next day. The German women gathered in the recreation room and read in heavy silence. The articles described concentration camps that the German public claimed not to have known existed. They detailed systematic atrocities, industrial-scale murder, horrors so extreme that they seemed impossible. The women read about Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, places they had never heard of, despite being German citizens who had served their country. Hertha read an article, quoting German civilians living near camps who insisted they had known nothing. She wanted to believe them, wanted to believe in innocent ignorance, but she found she could not. She had chosen not to ask questions when people disappeared. She had accepted explanations that made no sense because asking for better explanations would have been dangerous. She had known something was wrong, but had told herself it was none of her business, that she was just a small person trying to survive. The coconut cake that had made her cry had been a revelation about American abundance. These newspapers were a revelation about German complicity. The days following the newspaper reading were the darkest since the women's arrival. They moved through their routines mechanically, speaking little even among themselves. The kitchen work continued because it was assigned duty, but the eager questions about recipes ceased. The women's faces reflected something beyond sadness, a fundamental crisis of identity that no amount of abundant food could address. Sergeant Bowman noticed the change immediately. The easy camaraderie that had developed over weeks of working together had vanished overnight. When he tried to teach a new recipe for pecan pie, the women followed instructions, but without their usual intense focus and endless questions. They were physically present, but emotionally absent, trapped in whatever thoughts were consuming them from within. Captain Chandler called an emergency meeting with her staff. "We need to address what's happening. These women have access to information about what their country did, and they're not handling it well. I'm concerned about mental health, about possible self-harm." She looked at Lieutenant Templeton. "What do you recommend?" "We need to let them process it, Captain. Give them space, but also make it clear we're available if they want to talk. Trying to force them to feel better would be counterproductive. They need to work through this grief and shame in their own time." Templeton paused. What they're experiencing is what every German will eventually have to face. The question is whether they emerge from it with hope or despair. Father Sebastian Grant arrived 3 days later, having been summoned by Captain Chandler. The priest was German-American himself, had family still living in Bavaria, and spoke fluent German. He met with the women in the recreation room, all 43 of them gathered in silence. He did not offer easy comfort or quick absolution. Instead, he spoke about collective guilt and individual responsibility, about the difference between shame and repentance. "You cannot change what your country did," he told them in German, his words heavy with his own grief for the land of his ancestors. "You cannot undo the suffering that was inflicted in Germany's name. But you can choose what you do with this knowledge. You can let it destroy you, or you can let it transform you into people who will never again look away. From injustice, never again accept explanations that excuse cruelty." Hertha spoke up, her voice raw. "But Father, we are guilty. Maybe we didn't know the full extent, but we knew something was wrong. We chose not to ask questions. We chose to believe convenient lies. How do we live with that? How do we deserve to eat American coconut cake when we stood by while others starved?" The priest nodded slowly. "You don't deserve it. None of us deserve grace when we receive it, but that's what makes it grace rather than payment. The Americans who feed you well, who treat you with dignity, they're not saying you're innocent. They're saying that even the guilty deserve to be treated as human beings. Your responsibility now is to become worthy of that grace through how you live the rest of your lives." His words didn't erase the grief, but they offered a framework for processing it. The women began to talk among themselves, first in small groups and then in longer communal conversations that stretched late into the night. They shared what they had seen during their service, the moments when they should have questioned, should have resisted, should have refused. February 1945 brought news that Germany was collapsing. The Red Army was advancing from the east, Allied forces pushing from the west, and the Third Reich was disintegrating under the combined assault. In prisoner of war camps across America, German soldiers prepared for eventual repatriation to a homeland that no longer resembled the country they had left. The women at Fort Mitchell followed these developments with growing dread, knowing their captivity would eventually end, but uncertain what freedom would mean. Captain Chandler received preliminary orders regarding repatriation procedures. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe, then released to return to whatever remained of their homes and families. The timeline was vague, dependent on countless logistical factors, but the inevitability was clear. The women would be going back to Germany. The prospect filled them with complicated emotions that kept Hertha awake most nights. Germany was her homeland, the country of her language and culture, the place where her family had lived for generations. But it was also the country that had committed atrocities she could barely comprehend, that had lied to its citizens so thoroughly that truth and fiction had become indistinguishable. How could she return to a place that represented both home and horror? In the kitchen, conversations about recipes took on new urgency. The women copied techniques into their notebooks with meticulous detail, knowing they would likely never have access to ingredients like coconut or vanilla extract or even white sugar once they returned. They were documenting not just recipes, but memories of a time when food represented pleasure rather than mere survival. Sergeant Bowman understood what they were doing without being told. He began teaching simpler recipes, dishes that could be made with basic ingredients that might be available even in devastated Germany, potato soup that could be stretched to feed many, bread that could be made with minimal flour, ways to make food satisfying even when ingredients were scarce. His generosity had evolved from showing them abundance to preparing them for renewed scarcity. "When you get back home," he told them through Hertha's translation, "things are going to be hard for a long time, but you'll remember that abundance is possible. You'll know that scarcity isn't natural or inevitable. Maybe that knowledge will help you rebuild toward something better." He paused, his Georgia drawl thick with emotion. "You ladies have changed how I think about enemies. You've shown me that people caught up in bad systems can still be good people trying to do right." Private Delgado gave each woman a small packet of seeds, chilies, and herbs that could be grown in German gardens if they survived the journey. "My abuela always said that hope grows in gardens. Even if you don't have much food, you can grow something. These seeds, they're tough. They'll survive pretty much anywhere. The gifts were small, but represented something larger. The Americans were acknowledging that the women would face hardship upon return, but were offering tools to help them survive it. The gesture moved the prisoners deeply, because it suggested their captors had come to care about their futures beyond the prison camp walls. March arrived with the first hints of spring, and with it came more concrete information about repatriation. The war in Europe would end within weeks. Everyone could feel it. German resistance was collapsing, and the question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but how completely. The women at Fort Mitchell understood they would be among the last to be repatriated, as female prisoners represented a lower priority than the tens of thousands of male POWs held in camps across America. The delay gave them additional time to absorb what they had learned, to process the transformation they had undergone during their months of captivity. Hertha looked at her notebooks filled with recipes and reflections and realized she had documented her own psychological journey from Nazi Auxiliary Corps member to someone who could no longer accept the worldview she had been taught. The kitchen had become the center of this transformation. Here, surrounded by flour and sugar and butter, the women had learned that abundance was possible, that kindness could exist between enemies, that the propaganda defining their understanding of America had been comprehensively false. Every meal had been a lesson in how thoroughly they had been deceived by their own government. Lieutenant Templeton organized a final cooking demonstration, inviting local women from nearby towns to attend. The event was partly diplomatic, showing community members that German prisoners were human beings rather than monsters, and partly educational, allowing the prisoners to share what they had learned. The German women prepared a hybrid menu, German dishes made with American abundance, American dishes adapted to German techniques. Hertha stood before the gathered crowd, speaking in English that had become fluent through months of daily practice. When we arrived here, we believed Americans were our enemies. We believed you were suffering as much as Germans suffered, that everyone in the war struggled equally. We were wrong about everything. She gestured to the tables laden with food the prisoners had prepared. This abundance taught us more than any speech or propaganda film could teach. You cannot argue with coconut cake. You cannot dismiss butter and sugar as American lies. The food proved that everything we were told was false. Mina spoke next, describing her experience as a nurse in German field hospitals and how it compared to the medical care available in the American prison camp. In Germany, we were taught that our suffering built character, that deprivation made us strong. We were taught to be proud of our ability to endure hardship. But here, we learned that choosing hardship when abundance is possible is not strength. It is cruelty disguised as virtue. The local women listened with varying degrees of sympathy and skepticism. Some had lost sons or husbands to German weapons and found forgiveness difficult. Others recognized in the prisoners the same confusion and grief they had seen in their own returning soldiers. War damaged everyone it touched, victors and vanquished alike. Mrs. Lenora Atwood, who had been attending these demonstrations regularly, stood to speak. These women are not asking us to forget what Germany did. They are showing us that people can change when they are given truth instead of lies, abundance instead of artificial scarcity, and kindness instead of cruelty. That seems very American to me. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came over the radio at noon, and across America celebrations erupted spontaneously. Church bells rang, crowds filled streets, strangers embraced. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12, and its collapse was absolute and final. At Fort Mitchell, the news was met with complicated silence. The American personnel celebrated quietly, aware that their German prisoners might be experiencing the day differently. For the women, surrender meant both relief that the killing had stopped and grief for what their country had become. Germany had lost everything, its cities destroyed, its population scattered, its moral authority shattered beyond recovery. Captain Chandler addressed the prisoners in the afternoon, with Lieutenant Templeton translating, though most women no longer needed it. The war in Europe has ended. You will be repatriated as soon as transportation can be arranged. You are no longer enemy prisoners, but displaced persons awaiting return to your homeland. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I want you to know that you have changed how I understand our responsibilities as victors. You have taught me that our greatest strength lies not in defeating our enemies, but in how we treat them after victory is achieved. The women received official documents reclassifying their status. They would leave Fort Mitchell within 2 weeks, be processed through camps in Europe, then released to find their way in occupied Germany. The practicalities were overwhelming. Most had no confirmed information about surviving family members. The addresses they had known no longer existed, the cities where they had lived reduced to rubble. They would be returning to a country that was physically and morally devastated. That evening, Sergeant Bowman made one final coconut cake. He used the last of his hoarded coconut specifically for this purpose, creating the same towering 3-layer confection that had first broken through the women's defenses months earlier. When he carried it into the dining hall, the women stood spontaneously, not from military discipline, but from genuine respect for what this man and his cooking had represented in their lives. I wanted you to have this one more time, Clay said, his voice rough with emotion. I want you to remember that this kind of sweetness exists in the world. When things are hard in Germany, and they will be hard, remember that you've tasted abundance. Remember that people can choose kindness even toward their enemies. Remember that you are capable of change, of growth, of becoming better than you were. Each woman received a generous slice. They ate slowly, savoring not just the flavor, but the memory they were creating, the moment they would carry with them into an uncertain future. Hertha closed her eyes as she took her first bite, committing every sensation to memory. The sweetness of real sugar, the exotic taste of coconut, the richness of butter, the lightness of perfectly baked cake. This was what abundance tasted like. This was what she would remember. The final days at Fort Mitchell passed too quickly. The women packed their few possessions, mostly notebooks filled with recipes and reflections, a few gifts from American personnel, photographs taken during work assignments. They owned almost nothing, but they carried knowledge that would shape the rest of their lives. They had learned what abundance looked like, how kindness could transform enemies into friends, and how thoroughly their own government had betrayed them. Sergeant Bowman gave each woman leaving the kitchen detail a small package. Inside were basic baking tools, a whisk, measuring spoons, items that might survive the journey to Germany and prove useful in whatever future awaited them. He also included handwritten copies of his simplest recipes, dishes that could be made with minimal ingredients when proper supplies became available again. You taught me as much as I taught you, he told them during their final shift together. You reminded me why I became a cook in the first place. Feeding people is the most fundamental act of caring. You ladies came here as enemies, and you're leaving as friends. That's something I'll remember the rest of my life. Private Delgado organized a final meal that combined German and American traditions. The women helped prepare sauerbraten using American beef, potato pancakes fried in abundant butter, and apple strudel made with real cinnamon and sugar. The American personnel contributed fried chicken, cornbread, and sweet tea. The resulting feast represented the cultural exchange that had occurred over 6 months of shared kitchen work. During the meal, Minna stood to speak. Her English had improved dramatically, and she no longer needed Hertha to translate. When we came here, we were hungry in our bodies, but we were also hungry in our souls, though we did not know it. We had been fed lies so long that we forgot what truth tasted like. You fed us both food and truth, and both were difficult to swallow at first. She paused, emotion making her voice unsteady. We cannot undo what Germany did. We cannot bring back the people who were murdered, cannot rebuild the cities that were destroyed. But we can remember what we learned here. We can teach others that abundance is possible, that former enemies can become friends, that change is always possible for those willing to face uncomfortable truths. The women presented gifts to the American personnel who had most impacted their lives. For Captain Chandler, a carefully embroidered handkerchief with the camp's insignia. For Lieutenant Templeton, a German-English dictionary they had created together. For Sergeant Bowman, a recipe book they had compiled. German dishes written in English alongside his American recipes written in German. For Private Delgado, a small carved wooden box one of the women had made in the workshop. The gifts were simple but represented hours of secret work, tokens of gratitude that words alone could not convey. The Americans accepted them with visible emotion, understanding that these women had nothing to give except their time and skill, which made the gifts all the more valuable. 20 years after victory in Europe Day, Hertha Adler stood in her kitchen in Hamburg, teaching her teenage daughter how to make coconut cake. The Germany of 1965 bore little resemblance to the devastated wasteland she had returned to in 1945. The economic miracle had rebuilt cities, restored prosperity, and created a democracy that rejected everything the Third Reich had represented. But the internal work of rebuilding German character had been slower, more painful, and was still ongoing. Her daughter, Elise, watched with fascination as Hertha measured ingredients with American measuring cups she had somehow kept through 2 decades of chaos and reconstruction. "Mama, why do you always make this cake on May 8th?" Elise asked, knowing the date marked the anniversary of Germany's surrender, but not understanding her mother's particular relationship to it. Hertha paused, considering how much to explain. Elise knew her mother had been a prisoner of war, but they had never discussed the details deeply. "Because this cake taught me what abundance tastes like. It showed me that everything I had been told about America and about what was necessary was a lie. It was the first step toward understanding what Germany had become and what I had been part of." She told her daughter about Fort Mitchell, about Sergeant Bowman and his patient kindness, about Private Delgado and his chilies, about Captain Chandler, who had treated enemy prisoners with dignity. She described the shock of seeing real butter used generously, sugar added without thought, food prepared for pleasure rather than mere survival. "We cried when we first tasted this cake," she said quietly, "not because it was sad, but because it revealed how thoroughly we had been deceived." Elise listened with growing understanding. Her generation had grown up in the shadow of their parents' shame, knowing what Germany had done, but struggling to reconcile that knowledge with the ordinary people their parents seemed to be. "Did the Americans forgive you?" she asked. "They didn't need to forgive us. They simply treated us as human beings worthy of care despite being enemies. That was more powerful than forgiveness. It showed us what we could become if we chose differently." Hertha spread frosting on the cooled cake layers, her movements precise from decades of practice. "This cake represents the possibility of transformation. It proves that abundance can exist, that kindness can cross enemy lines, that people can change fundamentally when given truth instead of lies." The finished cake sat on the counter, 3 layers of white perfection covered in shredded coconut. Hertha had made it hundreds of times since returning to Germany, had taught the recipe to friends and neighbors, had used it to explain her experience to anyone willing to listen. Each cake was an act of memory and gratitude, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people could choose to see enemies as human beings deserving of dignity. "Come," she told her daughter, "let us eat this together and remember that sweetness is possible, that abundance is real, and that we must never again accept lies that make cruelty seem necessary."